We'll get into it in a second. So, welcome. We are live here on YouTube. We are live here on Instagram. And I hope you guys are having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to be talking about mitochondrial health, but we're going to be talking about it in a context that is a little bit different than what you might expect. And the reason we're starting this way is because we have to start with where all life comes from, right? So I wrote this on IG in the handle. It says mitochondria in reverse. And we're going to be talking about mitochondria the next few weeks and light health and light in the picture. But in order to talk about mitochondria and really get the full picture, we have to look at another system first. Why? Because mitochondria don't act alone. So and this is the bigger picture. So let's zoom out a little bit and talk about this. So, you know, when you're talking about practitioners in our conventional centralized health system, most of us are broken down into specialists, right? We become specific people who do specific things on specific parts of the body. And that's not necessarily like how things work. And this whole video will be on YouTube for sure. I'm not sure if it's going to be on IG, but it will be on YouTube. The problem is, like, with this system is that we end up missing the forest for the trees a lot of the times. And as more information comes out about health, like what we now have is not a lack of information. It's actually an inability to sort through the endless streams of it, right? And what most folks end up doing is they end up outsourcing that to external authorities, right? We have the CDC, we have the World Health Organization, things of this nature that are essentially doing the job, doing that discerning for us. And unfortunately, that's gotten us to a place where we're now the sickest species on the planet, that being modern human beings. And, things don't have to be hopeless. I know this comes up. I saw a comment yesterday I was talking about, gut health and all the things that can really play a role with it. And it's like, oh, well, what can we do? There's so many things that can play a role here. Like, it's overwhelming. And you get to that feeling of hopelessness, but it's not about that. This is actually about the opposite. It's about empowerment. And it's until you have the knowledge, you have the information, that you can make informed decisions, right? So you can't make an informed decision if you're constantly outsourcing and thinking that, like, oh, someone else knows what's right for me all the time, without any context. So you have to have some context. And this is what becoming decentralized, becoming independent, becoming empowered is really about, and really should be. And this is where mitochondria come in. So, like, what we're going to talk about the next few weeks is essentially building up these systems and how they all work. And we have to start at the foundational level before we build up, right? Like, that's really where it is. And we have to start with the life cycle itself. And the life cycle does not start with us and animals. It starts with light and plants. Now, before we get too dialed in, like, I think you have to understand that we live in a world with evidence-based medicine, which on its own is not necessarily a bad thing, unless it's not, the foundation isn't built on things that aren't necessarily true. Now, what do I mean by that? Last year, there was a study that came out that said 99% of all Alzheimer's drug trials and treatments are considered not effective, harmful, or have no benefit to patients. Why was this the case? Because all of the evidence that they were doing was based on an initial study that was fraudulent. The data was fraudulent. So the billions of dollars and potentially millions of lives that were negatively affected because someone played with data years back has had exponentially poor effects on people. So that doesn't mean that it's a bad system, but it is bad if the foundation isn't true. That's kind of like where we are today. So my guiding light, my North Star when I look at these things, is I have two questions. Is one, does nature make mistakes? And I'll tell you right now, the answer to that question for me is no. The second is, Does that statement, so what the observation that some people are saying, say in a random control trial, is that aligning with what you actually, with what nature actually presents to us? Because here's the thing, our paradigm that we use for science is something made by man. And again, that doesn't inherently make it bad, but we have to realize that nature, Mother Nature, does not play by the rules that we put on it. It has its own set of rules that it works by. We are doing our best to understand it. But when we use poor foundation and assume things and don't double check our work, we lose, say, billions of dollars as a collective and potentially millions of lives because we're assuming someone did something correct and not fact checking it and not, again, taking it back to nature. Now, why is this so this is like an important understanding to what's going on now as we break it down and go a little bit deeper, you have to understand that each of us adults, roughly 100 trillion cells, roughly 25 trillion of those are red blood cells, and the rest, whether it's, muscle cells, if they make up glands, the pituitary, the heart, the brain, etc., they all have to work in a cohesive unit. This is partially why specialized medicine becomes a problem, because when you're focusing on one aspect of one thing, you're not seeing the full picture, which again leads to this more microscopic reductionist view, which again can be a problem when taken out of context. Now, for cells to work properly, two things need to happen. They need to have all of their needs met from a nutrition standpoint, from a hydration standpoint, from an electrolyte standpoint, and they need to make sure that their actions are not impeded by excess physical, chemical, or emotional stress. Stresses aren't necessarily bad, but because actually, literally, what does not kill us makes us stronger. That's called hormesis, hormetic stress. These things are useful and actually necessary to become more resilient and healthy. When you tip the balance away from that, it becomes a problem. Now, we'll talk about mitochondria quick before we talk about the reverse, because the reverse is what's important when we're getting started, is we have to talk about ATP. Now, I think every single person listening to this or who will listen to this has heard the tagline, ATP is the cell currency of the body. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. But I don't think we go deep enough in as far as realizing, like, what does that actually mean? So that's kind of where we need to start. So what ATP is, which is called adenosine triphosphate, it actually is considered a nucleic acid. Now, technically speaking, there are four major types of biomolecules. First three you're aware of. They're carbohydrates, they're lipids, they're proteins. There's a fourth, and they're called nucleic acids. Now, ATP falls into that latter one, the same thing that DNA would fall into, or RNA, ATP falls into. It's a nucleic acid. And what makes they're essentially three-part structures. There's a base, in the case of ATP, that's adenine. There's a sugar part, which in the case of ATP is ribose. And the triphosphate is literally three groups that have three phosphates in them. Hence triphosphate. So that's where the name comes from. Now, ATP has it can be used for a lot of things. It moves molecules against concentration gradients. That's what we call active transport. It helps muscle contract, so I can move my arm back and forth like this, and also helps cell signaling pathways. So, and these take energy, which is what ATP does. So essentially, what happens is ATP gets hydrolyzed. All that means is you take one of the phosphate groups, and it gets cut off. When you break that bond, it releases energy, and that is the energy used in whatever it is. So to move my arm, I'm using the energy from breaking those bonds to allow me to move my arm towards my shoulder here. What happens after that? We need to regenerate the ATP. It becomes ADP, adenosine diphosphate, two phosphates instead of three. And then we have to add that third one back on, and the cycle will repeat itself. Now, in animals, there's three ways we do that. There's aerobic respiration, which is what we're going to be talking about. That uses oxygen. And then there's two ways that don't. It's called anaerobic and fermentation. Now, today we're going to be talking about aerobic respiration. Now, in plants actually are called autotrophs, meaning they actually create their own ATP and their own food. So humans are not autotrophs because we have to eat food to get energy. Plants actually create the sugars, the glucose, and then use that glucose to create energy. So they don't need an outside source to bring in energy. They actually literally create their own. The only input they need really is light, sunlight. And that's where this story actually starts. It's with sunlight. And it also starts that way with mitochondria too. But we have to talk about how this works. So I've talked about this before, but the electron transport chain is essentially how we use aerobic respiration. And it's essentially a series of a few proteins that use electrons to create water and then create a proton gradient, which means one side is more acidic than the other, right? Because what is potential of hydrogen? pH. It means that there is more hydrogens without an electron. So just protons, really. We're talking about protons on one side than the other. Those protons are then used to fuel something called ATP synthase, which goes around a cycle and then creates ATP. Literally, it churns it out. It is a motor. It looks and works like a motor if you actually see it in motion. It's very cool. But what we don't talk about a lot is the fact that water is the other byproduct. And this is what a lot of people miss because I think we focus so much on the ATP, we forget the fact that we're 70% water and 99% of the molecules in our body are water. So it would seem a little bit ridiculous, and I'll say, to assume that, like, oh, this is just a byproduct and it doesn't do anything, right? If it's 99% of the molecules in our body, don't you think it would have a little bit more of a function than just being a byproduct or just a bath for all these different things? Like, it would have a function. This is where photosynthesis comes in. So photosynthesis takes sunlight to split water and then eventually creates oxygen and sugar using carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. Now, what's important to understand here is that photosynthesis in a chloroplast is effectively the mirror image of a mitochondria. They effectively do opposite reactions. And you'd be surprised like how many people overlook this and like don't think this is super important. They mirror each other literally. So and you can actually look if you actually look and Google after this, like go and Google what a chloroplast looks like. It looks a lot like a mitochondria and actually functions a lot the same way. And there will be pictures to go along with this tomorrow because this is what this week's newsletter is about. Because if we don't understand chloroplasts and photosynthesis first, we're going to miss the bigger picture with mitochondria because they are effectively the same thing. Just one is in plants, one is in animals. And you can take this a step further because if you look at chlorophyll and you look at hemoglobin, which are effectively the things that are going to transfer and shuttle oxygen to get to where you want to go, their structure is effectively the same. The biggest difference is hemoglobin contains iron, chlorophyll contains magnesium. And they actually, and if you look at them, it's stunningly similar as far as their structure goes. So you need to understand, like, nature doesn't make mistakes. This stuff was there, is created in this way on purpose. We have these nitrogen cages. One has iron, one has magnesium. We have chloroplasts, we have mitochondria that effectively do opposite reactions and feed each other. All of this is triggered by sunlight. So without sunlight, without plants, we don't exist. Mitochondria cannot do what they do to feed this cycle so that it continues and the life cycle continues. So this is much bigger than an energy source for us. This is literally how we give back to the environment and how life continues on this planet. So that's the macro part of this that's important. Now, how does photosynthesis work? So essentially, like I said, you're going to take CO2, carbon dioxide, going to take water, sunlight's going to hit a plant, and at the end of it, you're going to create glucose and oxygen. And two separate functions create each. But this is initiated by light. Now, what does light do? Light actually takes water molecules and splits it. So it splits it into oxygen and protons. Well, hydrogen. The hydrogens then split into electrons, which create the ATP and the NADPH, which we'll talk about. And the hydrogen creates that gradient that is used to make ATP, similar to how it's used in mitochondria, just in chloroplasts. And you'll see this in a picture. So this is actually called photolysis. So this is literally the splitting of water using light. That is the definition. Photolysis. You split water with light into protons, electrons, and oxygen. The electrons are used to essentially make NADPH. The protons are used to make ATP, very similar to how we use them in mitochondria. So you're actually seeing similar reactions in plants and animals to get a similar result. Now, what plants do that are different is they take this ATP and go through a second stage of photosynthesis. And the second stage of photosynthesis is what we call the Calvin cycle or the dark reactions. And so the byproduct of this first part of photosynthesis is we split water into oxygen, protons, electrons. The electrons are used to create NADPH. The hydrogen protons are used to make ATP. The oxygen is given off so that we can breathe it. So the second step is taking that NADPH, that ATP, and using it to create sugar. And that's effectively what happens. And there's 3 different ways you do it. We're not going to go too much into the details on that. That's more for tomorrow's blog post. But basically what's happening is the plants will then take in CO2 from the environment, use the ATP and NADPH to create sugars that then feed the cycle for the plants and also for us. So that's how we use that for energy, and also how plants use their own sugars to function, to create, to regenerate essentially photosynthesis. This is why they're called autotrophs. They create their own food, and the only input they really need is sunlight and water. But that is effectively what's happening. So why is photosynthesis important? It's because it mirrors what mitochondria do, and they have the same input, which is light. Light is the catalyst for both of them. Photosynthesis is the precursor to what mitochondria do, because without them, we can't function without oxygen. Now, what photosynthesis does is, we talked about chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is that green pigment, and it's called the light harvesting complex. So basically what it does is it takes light, which allows photosynthesis to essentially do what it needs to do. And effectively what happens is photosynthesis takes this sunlight, it splits water like we talked about. This creates a battery. Water is effectively an electromagnetic capacitor, meaning it can store electrical energy in the form of charge. So what is charge? That's the protons and electrons. That's when you split the water, you get the oxygen that comes off that we breathe. The hydrogen gets broken up into single electrons and single protons. When you have a positive charge, a positive proton, right? P for positive, electrons negative, you now have a positive and a negative portion. That essentially creates a battery. And that is exactly what happens in our mitochondria. And this is all affected by light. So light is actually able to take these bonds in water and bend and break them with sunlight as the only input. Now, water can do some amazing things. We know that as we freeze water, what happens? It creates a crystalline structure, right? So what happens? These water molecules essentially arrange themselves as more in this kind of like hexagonal shape. In liquid water, they're denser. That's why ice floats. So if you're a fish, that's good news, right? Because it's going to freeze over you. It's not going to freeze from the bottom. It's going to freeze on top. That's also why ice floats. It's less dense. You can pack liquid water more together because it's not as organized. Now, this is where, if you haven't read or watched Gerald Pollack's video on the 4th phase of water and And I actually really suggest watching the YouTube video. I did a TED talk on it. It's like 20 minutes and it essentially explains the book. This is what sunlight does in mitochondria. It creates a gel-like substance, effectively a liquid crystal, when sunlight hits it. This is what's happening in mitochondria. So in other words, the water inside your mitochondria is not the same water that's in your water bottle if it's not exposed to sunlight. And when you take that away, you're not going to get, it's not going to look the same. What happens is when you actually, what it will do is it will, it's crazy. It actually makes a crystal structure, a liquid crystal structure, similar to what ice kind of looks like as far as like the shape. But what that does is also create a charge separation. So effectively, what happens in mitochondria, you have this negative area and this positive area in mitochondria. And this is created when, again, sunlight comes into the picture, particularly infrared light, which penetrates the skin and creates essentially a quantum battery. And when you have liquid crystalline shapes, they create what are known as photon traps, which effectively mean they can take photon light energy and keep it there, creating a battery. And he actually did measurements on this. He did actually studies on this where he put electrodes, one in this, what he calls EZ zone, one in what they call the bulk water zone. The EZ zone had a net negative charge. This had a net positive charge. You can actually create a battery for free using light. This is the power of structured water, and this is what happens in our mitochondria. The interaction between sunlight and water can effectively create a never-ending supply of electrons for plants and animals that we can use for energy. These are redox electrons that we can use to create energy. And it's for free. All you need is sunlight. It's really wild, like how this stuff works. And you know, it gets deeper too, because when we're talking about mitochondria, maybe this is something we'll save for next week, but it's important to talk about now. Like we spend so much time talking about antioxidants. There's a bit more we need to understand about reactive oxygen species. Sometimes you'll see them as free radicals. Technically, that's partially true. So reactive oxygen species are a larger umbrella, if you will. So not all free radicals are reactive oxygen species. Or sorry, all free radicals are reactive oxygen species or ROS, but not all reactive oxygen species are free radicals. I know free radicals have a negative connotation, but if you look at the electron transport chain, we'll talk a little bit more about this next week. Reactive oxygen species are a byproduct of it. Now, I talked about this in previous blog posts, but again, does nature make mistakes? No. So why is the body creating reactive oxygen species as a part of the electron transport chain? Why would that happen? Turns out we actually need a certain level of reactive oxygen species, and these go by different names. You'll see singlet oxygen, or you'll see hydroxyl radicals, superoxide radicals, nitric oxide, which I know a lot of people talk about the benefits of. That's actually a reactive oxygen species. Hydrogen peroxide. They have a lot of different roles, including cell signaling. So we actually need a certain amount to get certain messages to cells. We need reactive oxygen species to initiate apoptosis. So if we don't have the right amount of them, we can't go through the programmed cell death that we need to for optimal health. We need it for mitochondria function. Now, if you read back on one of the blogs I did on light, you'd know that melatonin is primarily made in the mitochondria and not in the pineal gland. And that melatonin is used to help balance the reactive oxygen species made in the mitochondria. And it is triggered not by darkness, but by infrared light. That is a really important distinction to make because that is not how I learned about melatonin, and it's also not the way I learned about it working. Now, and what's important about reactive oxygen species are these are a product potentially of UV light that cells create on their own. So what I'm saying here is mitochondria actually release energy or biophotons in the form of reactive oxygen species. These actually emit UV light. So when you look at a Kirlian photograph, what you're seeing is the UV light, the biophotons given off from mitochondria production. This is why if you have flies and you tend to get bit a lot, say by flies or mosquitoes, they're actually seeing the UV light given off. So if you give off a lot, too much UV light, you're going to get bit a lot more. So that means there's too much reactive oxygen species. You're not having the balance you need. This is how they see. This is how this actually works. So it literally, if you're shining too bright because of too much reactive oxygen species given off, this could be a problem as well. Um, and this is why this stuff is so important. And this is why I keep mentioning in these blogs that we effectively are beings that are frozen liquid crystal light. And there's a book. It's honestly a lot if you're just jumping into it, but it's called Vibrational Medicine by Richard Gerber. It's a little bit, if you don't have like a physics or science background, it might be a tough jumping off point. I would say the fourth phase of order is a much easier, approachable read, but really worthwhile. And then Fritz Pop, who is one of the original researchers on biophotons, he even said, this is a quote, we are still on the threshold of fully understanding the complex relationship between light and life. But we can say now emphatically that the function of our entire metabolism is dependent on light. So, what have we been talking about the last half hour? We have been talking about how photosynthesis uses light to literally create energy and create sugars. We use it to create our own individual batteries inside each mitochondria. This is all done via light. This is why when I'm starting to talk about, this stuff is really important when we're in front of the blue lights at night, when we're not getting the full spectrum. When you see studies that I've posted recently where you're saying, oh, putting a red light on someone's back for 15 minutes is lowering blood sugar levels, what that means is we're not getting the full spectrum that we need. And when you get sunlight, you're getting everything from infrared to UV. You do not get that with the artificial lights in your room, from the screens. These are going to increase your blue light spectrum, but you're not getting the red, the infrareds to balance it out. So it's not that red light is going to save you on its own. It's that you're not getting the whole spectrum in what you're designed to get. And we filter that when we're in front of windows, when we wear sunglasses, when we wear sunscreens. All of these are going to negatively affect that because you're not going to get the light you need in the amounts you need at the right time of day. This is why this stuff is so important. Like I cannot overstate it. Now, from a quantum standpoint, and we're talking about food, one of the reasons that biophotons are important, and just so we're clear, I talked about this in a previous one. Biophotons are essentially low level luminescence, like that are given off during cellular respiration, like we talked about. But effectively, this is the light show that goes on not only in our cells, in the bacteria in our body as well, because they create them too. So we have our own light shows going on in the gut at every given time. And foods have this as well. So we see this like it is effectively the sign of life force in the body, these biophotons. And in tomorrow's post, like there'll be some pictures so you can see it. But like when you compare organic foods to conventional food, you'll see there is literally more life force, more biophotonic emissions from organic foods versus conventional ones. You'll see sprouts that can play a role. Chi absolutely can certainly be an analogy for this. This is why when you look at more ancient cultures, they're all effectively talking about the same thing. You're using different language to do it, but it is effectively the same. This is prana, this is chi, this is that. This is literally that life force. This is what biophotons are, just we're using different language. So from a quantum standpoint, what are the foods that are going to repair that? And this is the important point that I want to end with today, and why we have to talk about photosynthesis before we talk about mitochondria, because that's where the life force starts. It starts with the sun and goes to plants, because without either one of those, we don't exist. And it sounds crazy, but the truth is, we all learned this in third grade in biology. We did. So, w- really, the question is, instead of worrying about carbohydrates and proteins and fats, like, what the question, in my opinion, that we should be looking at when we're talking about nutrition is what foods, quite literally, are giving us the most light energy. So it might not, surprise you, which foods, I could give you a second if you want to guess, like which foods might be the most, from a quantum standpoint, from a biophotonic perspective, what foods might give off the most light energy. It's going to be your organic fruits and vegetables. It's going to be foods that are exposed to the sun, that have structured water in them. So what we talked about with photosynthesis, when you consume, let's take vegetables for example, because they have leaves, leafy greens for example, which would be a good source. They're going to take in this water or this sunlight and structure the water. So you can actually get structured water, higher amounts of biophotons, by literally just consuming, especially raw fruits and vegetables. But like, do you see how much more important this is? Because not only that, you're going to get the electrolytes that allow this whole system to function better. And they're in those same foods. Now, when you cook foods, that's going to diminish it a little bit, but other foods are great. Nuts and seeds, sprouts. Why? Because these are literally where life starts, in nuts and seeds. Seeds are effectively what? Like they're the beginnings of plants. You can water them and they will turn into plants. Sprouts, especially if you look at Kirlian photography, they have huge biophotonic energies given off. Why? Because they are churning out so much energy because they are growing so fast. So the higher life force literally the foods have, dark leafy greens, berries, these things grown in the sun are going to be the best source of these biophotons. It's really cool. Like, if you want to read more about this, there's another great book. It's called The Secret Life of Plants. The author goes into the studies done by a man named Andre Simonton. I hope I said his name right. He's a French guy. This was in like the 1930s and 40s, who actually looked at this and measured the energy life force of foods and broke them up into different classifications based on their energy output. And you could check that out too. And it's again a lot of the stuff that we just mentioned. So in my opinion, when as we go into the future here, like, to me, this is where nutrition should be going. We should be talking about source, chi, prana. What is that actually? That's the sun in the sky that allows all of this to happen. And everything beyond that is a derivative of that in one way or another. This is why, partially, why processed foods are so bad. They have zero life force, none. Never mind the added stuff that allows them to stay around longer and can lead to more issues. So, to me, like, where I think we will go in my lifetime, in my opinion, is this is where we should be going in nutrition, and this concept of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, and calories in, calories out is not necessarily, well, it doesn't work. We already know that. Like this, it is already, we are not human calculators. That is not how digestion works. We need to start looking at this from a light and water perspective. So this is why we have to go over photosynthesis first. And this is also why we're going to be diving into mitochondria, which again is the mirror image of it. And we're going to do that next week. So I hope that you found this helpful. Before you go, if you haven't yet, all this information that we just talked about today is going to be on my newsletter, the Becoming Invincible newsletter. It's going to be in text form tomorrow in much more detail. You sign up for that. The link's in my bio. Every single Friday, something's coming out. That's going to be this week. Next week, we'll talk about mitochondria in more detail. If you haven't checked out my book yet, my ebook, over 150 different superfoods in it. You could check it out. Nature's Kitchen and Cabinet talks a lot about this stuff. Really easy way to get you started. And if you haven't checked out my webinar yet on insulin resistance and how you can actually use things like sunlight to help improve it, go check it out. That's what I got for you today. Especially the newsletter, if you could get on that, especially with the way certain information is being throttled, getting connected off of these platforms is of utmost importance. And I promise that every week I will be getting you some information that hopefully you can find useful and practical. So I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you for hanging out. I will see you next week.